Welcome everybody to the weekly Village Torah portion discussion here on Village Torah. I'm very excited to do a first, which is Emily.
Hi, Emily.
It's our very first ever presentation from her in this format. So I'm going to let Emily take it away from here. Emily.
Great, thanks, Rabbi Drew. So this week's parsha is Hukat, which is another parsha in Numbers. And today we're going to look at, well, for this particular session, we're going to look at one specific motif, referred to by one of my professors as the rock water motif. Basically, whenever Moses is getting water from the rock, that seems relatively self-explanatory, I would assume. I have this mapped out, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen that has the actual text, so you'll be able to see the actual text that I'm talking about. So we have, this motif comes up twice, and one of the goals of this is to try to figure out what the motif is trying to do, because everything that goes into the Bible, I guess, or really any piece of literature this could apply to, has a purpose of some sort. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the Exodus story in as much depth as I can, but if you have questions about it, I can do that. Essentially, in Exodus, we find out there's no water. The people complain, tell Moses, hey, give us some water. We don't have water. And Moses says, and they go back and say, what's the point of you bringing us out of Egypt if we're just going to die of thirst, and all of our possession, our animals are going to die of thirst, and our families are going to die of thirst, and what's the point? Then Moses cries out to God. Moses is told to hit the rock with his rod, which is like a staff kind of thing, and he's told to hit the rock and water will come out of it, and there will no longer be a drought, and the people can drink from that and they won't all die. Great, cool. Then Moses does that. There's no bad consequences there besides the fact that the place is named for the fact that the Israelites were complaining at that place. So that's like a whirlwind through that story. So now let's focus on the one that's actually in our parsha this week. That's actually in Hukat, which is the story that is in Numbers. And the same motif appears again. We find out there is not water again. This time it is because Miriam died, and she seems to be the purveyor, I suppose. The water follows Miriam. We'll go with that. And then the congregation once again complains. Why didn't we perish before? Why are you bringing us here just to die? Why did you do this? There's nothing to do. There's nothing to eat. There's nothing to drink. This time Moses and Aaron go to God and they ask, what's going on? We need water, etc. And they basically pray to God, being like, we need to figure out what the heck we need to do here. God appears to them. God says, talk to the rock this time. The purpose of this one is to explain how they still had water after Miriam's death, and it is the consequences of Moses hitting the rock when he is told to talk to the rock. Consequence is that Moses is not allowed to enter the land of Canaan. It just says the land that I have given you. Or I guess the land that verb tenses are confusing. The land that I have given you, and that I have designated for you, which is assumed to be the land of Israel, because Moses is then not allowed to go into the land of Israel. So now it's important to try to think about the ways that these two stories relate to one another. I'm going to scroll back up so you can see the beginning of the story. And it seems like these are two variations on the same motif, the same idea, this like idea that rocks can bring us water if God tells us rocks can bring us water, with some variations on the situational aspects of the whole thing. So it seems like we're looking at a motif adaptation and not the same story written twice, although we have that earlier in the Bible, but that's a whole nother conversation and not what we're talking about today. And these two texts are serving two different purposes. And the difference between a rewritten story and a motif adaptation is a little bit confusing, so I'm just going to back up for a second to explain that. My favorite example of this is the way that Disney has adapted various fairy tales that came from the Grimm brothers and had very different, but they're all the same story. You can also think about this with Romeo and Juliet, because Romeo and Juliet is also West Side Story, and many other plays or musicals or things that are very similar to that. I believe there's also an opera that I cannot remember the name of. We also have rewritten stories in the Bible with the narratives about both Isaac and Abraham using their wives in order to get things from foreign kings. Those happen much earlier in the books in Genesis. So one of the rules that one of my professors actually taught us is what he calls the swap out rule, which is essentially if you can switch the two things and the purpose of the story, the idea of the story, like the core idea, I just said that, of the story can be the same thing, then it is a motif adaptation and it's a crucial part of the motif. So if they can be switched, the adaptation, the part that it was changed between the Exodus story and the Numbers story, does not affect the overall story of the Bible. For example, Miriam cannot die we hear that Miriam died in our Numbers story. Miriam can't die in Exodus because she's present in stories that happen between Exodus and Numbers. That's probably the simplest example. There's also a question when we're in this adaptation of who has the power, because here we have in Exodus, Moses is really the core seat of power, at least in this story. Aaron is of course present in Exodus, very important in other parts of the story, but not important in this particular instance. But now you hear in this 113 verse chunk, you hear of all three of the siblings. You have Miriam dying, and the consequences of Miriam dying being that there is no water. And then you have Moses and Aaron trying to figure out what to do. And the purpose of the second story is to try to figure out how to get Moses, Aaron, and Miriam away from the seat of power, because eventually we're going to end up with an Israelite power system that's completely different than this that Moses, Aaron, and Aaron still actually is more present in it, but that's beside the point. Not a less biological, I suppose, power structure that doesn't really exist in the first place. And then we can also look at Moses's action here, which I need to scroll down for. Like, what does Moses do? Because clearly Moses does the same thing in both of these texts. Like, we can read this. It says, "Thus Moses did so in front of the elders of Israel." And then the Numbers text says, "Moses took the rod from before God as he had been commanded. Moses and Aaron assembled the community near the rock and said to them, 'Listen, please, rebels, shall we find water for you in this rock?' And Moses lifted his hand and hit the rock with his rod 2 times, and large amounts of water came out." While we don't see the actual miracle taking place in Exodus, you can disagree with me, but I don't see a really crucial difference between those two things. However, the consequences, obviously, are extremely different. In the Exodus story, they get water. There's no more drought. Everything's fine. Great. They'll also get manna, but that's not in this chunk. But the second time, Moses takes the rod and strikes the rock once, and then water comes out. He needs to be striking the rock twice, though, both in the Exodus text and 2 times in the Numbers text. in order for him to be like punished by God. Because if his action of just striking the rock once in Exodus did not get him in trouble. He was fine. Nothing happened. He was still in power. All was good. But then when we go to the Numbers text, where's the thing? He hits the rock 2 times, which, at least from what I've read, indicates that that was the way that he was disobeying God, and that's how we explain why he was punished the second time and not punished the first time. I mean, Moses gets frustrated. We can assume that Moses got frustrated in both sections, so I'm not going to focus too much on that. But it's an interesting idea to look at, because we see this thing that we don't see as a huge deal. Hitting the rock twice as opposed to once, because he was angry. We've all done things that were not always the best when we're angry or frustrated or anything like that. But he gets punished with probably what's the worst punishment of Moses' life, which is the opportunity to lead his people up until the edge, I suppose, of the river, and not go into the land that he has been promised, that he has been working towards with him, or with them, excuse me. And the Israelites are aggravated in both places, but I get, maybe it's not a conscious choice, but he chooses to react differently in the second text. And it's all about, in this particular case, and the way I interpret it, it's all about trusting God. So if you trust that God will give you something, if you just talk to the rock instead of the necessity to hit the rock like there was in Exodus, because there are 2 different instructions also, if I didn't say that ahead of time, I don't remember. If there's 2 different, it's about trusting God. Moses and Aaron, the way that this is interpreted is that Moses and Aaron did not trust God, because God is said to say to Moses and Aaron that you will not lead the congregation into the land because you didn't trust in me, because you didn't do what I said. And this also brings up some theological questions that is a little more complicated as to like yes, we had a direct command from God, but what happens when we don't have a direct command? And also, are there exceptions to the direct command? None of those are explicitly relevant to this, but I think it's interesting to look at and just see that these 2 motifs seem really similar, or these 2 stories seem really similar, and yet at the end of the day, Moses doesn't get to go into the land of Israel, even though he did the same thing that he did in the previous one. And I could, of course, go more into detail on any of those, but I was trying to make it a little bit shorter because this could have taken me an hour and a half. I know I did that quickly, so like if there's anything I can clarify, please let me know.
So, all right. So I have a few things.
Sure.
Well, first of all, the first thing I have to point out, which is that it's really neat. I never thought about these and so mirroring each other so so closely, which was super duper fascinating, at least to me. So that's really awesome. So cool. Thank you. That's awesome. That's fantastic. And it's a nice breakdown of everything. Okay. One thing I have is Miriam. So I know you mentioned that the water seemed to be because of, or you said the water was there because of Miriam. Immediately following her death, no more water.
I mean, that's what Rashi says in his commentary.
Right. So just to be clear, nowhere in the text does it overtly tell us that the water was there because of Miriam, and once she was no longer there, water was also no longer there. So
we're correct.
Right. And so that's definitely the realm of Midrash. And the rabbis, Rashi included, love to make that connection of you take out Miriam, you take out Mayim. No Miriam, no water. So I just want to be clear about that. It's not necessarily because of that. That's Midrash. Okay.
You're correct.
Okay, so I wanted to make that clear. The second thing is, there actually is a massive difference in the two stories. And that massive difference is what God commands Moses.
Yeah.
So in the first story in Exodus, God commands Moses, take the staff, strike it. He does that. He does what God commands him.
Yeah.
In the number story in this week's Torah portion, we have God says, take the staff and speak to the rock. So no striking involved, no hitting, just speaking, just talk. But instead of talking to the rock, Moses hits the rock. He strikes the rock. And it could be that Moses got very confused. Hey, when I take a rod and there's a rock we need to get water out of, I've done this before. I hit it, we get water. Doesn't that make sense? Except that was not the command from God here. It was speak to it. No, don't hit, speak to it, and you'll get water. That's the huge difference.
Yeah.
And
that's what makes the stories different.
Right. So that is definitely the difference. And also, of course, the aftermath, the consequence that God metes out for Moses. You're not going to get into the land. You didn't obey what I said. Yes, the Exodus story about the rock and water, you listened, you heeded my command, and you did exactly, and everybody's happy. Here, I gave you a very simple thing. Just talk to a rock. You will not only willfully disobeyed, but in public, in front of everybody. And now you ready for the Midrash? The Midrash piece of it, and I think Rashi talks about this, is that you're not going to get into the land because you disobeyed me.
Yeah,
and
I believe Rashi does talk about that.
Right. So, I don't know. That's what I got. So that's I think a very important
No, it's an important distinction to make.
Right, and no pun intended, but it's there, is the striking difference between these two stories is that he struck the rock, and that was the huge difference. He disobeyed God, and he seemed to almost like, I don't want to say desecrate, but he definitely was not sanctifying God in that moment.
Maybe disrespect God?
Yeah, he disrespected God by willfully disobeying him in public in such a fashion like that. Like, as you pointed out, really, really nicely, you laid out for us really incredibly well. Everything is so strikingly similar, and yet this one thing that is markedly different of God's command of don't hit it, just talk to it.
Yep.
That's and that ultimately is the consequence why it's different for Moses.
Yeah, and Aaron actually, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I enjoyed today. I always have something to think about.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, Emily definitely had a nice presentation.
Yes, she did.
Prepared for us. It was great.
And thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Debbie. And
You're welcome.
yes.
See you next week.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Debbie.
Very good job.
Yes. And Emily, thank you so much for leading this. This was really excellent, really neat, really interesting to think about how similar this paralleled the similar rock water experience in the book of Exodus. So thank you so much, Emily.
Thanks.
Mm.
Back next week.